Hi, hello, good morning. Good to see you again. And well, as you can see, the pandemic is showing our weaknesses, but also the pandemic is showing our strengths, like science. Science work. If not, well, remember, we are here because we are vaccinated, and vaccination is science. So yes, science work. I repeat it because after this conversation about misinformation, sometimes science is not enough. We need something else. We need trust. We have seen in Costa Rica, for example, in April 2021, that young population, they hesitate about vaccination. Why? Well, because they didn't trust the government. So what we did, we started developing some campaigns with soccer players. They don't trust the Ministry of Health, but they trust the soccer star of the local league. So, well, science is important, but also the connection with the communities is important. And to go deep into that, we have the pleasure to present Professor Wong, Professor of Innovation in the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. So, Professor, come on.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks very much. Let me begin by thanking the hosts of this terrific gathering for inviting myself as well as some colleagues from the REACH Alliance. I was one of those that participated in the ski shot yesterday, and so my head is a little foggy this morning. I would blame it on the ski shot, but actually it's because I have to say over the last day and a half, my head has just been filled with just tremendous insights, lots of threads that I'd love to be able to pull together in this talk, and I'm going to try to do the best that I can, but forgive me in advance if I'm not able to. About 8 years ago, I was actually in Addis Ababa. I was there doing some research on democratic governance, actually, so completely unrelated to this. And the driver that we had said, do you want to come see where I grew up? I said, yeah, sure, that'd be cool. So we went, and he took us to one of the many illegal housing settlements in Addis, a slum, and he took us around. And I had an opportunity, and I've worked in slums before, but never really thought about this before. And we were driving around. It's a real labyrinth, not unlike this image that I'm showing here. And we're driving around, and I realized there are no addresses. And so I say to my colleague, I say, there are no addresses here. He said, yeah, well, the locals know how to get around. The locals know how to figure their way out through these labyrinth slums. But you're right, not everyone does. And so then I started asking myself, well, if there are no addresses, then how do you get things to people? How do you get things like education interventions or cash transfers or sanitation interventions and so forth if you're unable to actually find them? And indeed, this is terrific anthropologist Arjun Appadurai who's done some work in Mumbai, and he's come up with very similar observations that, in the slums of Mumbai, the agents of the state, i.e. government, public policymakers and so forth, don't know who the people are, don't know where they are, and they don't know how to find them. And so this got me to thinking, how do we reach those who are hardest to reach? Consider, for instance, that as of about 8 years ago, according to UNICEF, approximately 30% of the world's children under the age of 5 did not have their births registered. It's about 230 million children under the age of 5, which means it's unlikely they have a birth certificate, which means it's unlikely they have any form of formal ID as a child. The Lancet has referred to this as a scandal of invisibility. Consider, for instance, that 50% of the new jobs that have been created over the last 20 years or so in the OECD countries, the club of rich nations, 50% of new jobs have been in the informal sector. Consider that the vast, vast majority of employment generated in low and middle income countries are also in the informal sector. Consider until recently about half the population in India did not have any formal identification. And as we heard yesterday, tragically, the formal numbers or the official numbers in terms of the number of children who have been unearthed in our residential schools is about 1,000. And as we heard from Karen Joseph, it actually numbers well into the tens of thousands. In other words, we are bound by the Sustainable Development Goal agenda in which we've all agreed that no one is to be left behind, and yet those who are hardest to reach are those who are the most invisible to us. put more succinctly and in today's context, when we think, for instance, about beating COVID, my epidemiologist colleagues have told me, herd immunity in normal times can be reached when vaccination rates reach around 60 to 70%. We now know in order to beat COVID, to eradicate it, herd immunity is going to require vaccination rates well over 92, 93%. In other words, we have to reach those who we have historically neglected, marginalized, or felt no need to reach. And that's what the work of the REACH Alliance is about. It's about reaching everyone. It's about the premise that reaching most is no longer good enough. And indeed, the work that we're doing at the REACH Alliance, which brings together students and professors from across the world, are investigating solutions. What has worked in reaching those who are the hardest to reach? At the core of the work that we're doing then really is a question about scaling. How do we scale up successful interventions so that they're able to reach everyone? I would put to you that the sort of conventional way in which we think about scaling is what I would call the kind of radiant or radiating model of scaling. It's a contiguous model. You take, for instance, here on the left, this is some mapping that we had done and worked with colleagues in Tanzania. There's a hub and spoke model of how you get things to people. There's a sort of contiguous idea here that you radiate outwards from a hub to the various spokes. Implicit in that as well is that through this radiant model that there is going to be the economies of scale that can be realized, and through that we're able to scale ever further. But the fact of the matter is that roads actually end. So Angela, who some of you will have met yesterday in the climate change workshop, was part of a research team that I was mentoring. We spent time in Tanzania. You recall when we got off the ferry in Mwanza, there were paved roads for about 2 or 3 miles. Those paved roads then became dirt roads. Those dirt roads then became paths. And you begin to ask yourself, how are we actually reaching those furthest away clinics? This idea, therefore, that you can radiate outwards from the metropole to the periphery is misleading. And some of the work that we've done here, and I just show this as illustrative, on the right is an optimized route map and how to deliver medical supplies to rural, hard-to-reach clinics in the Mwanza district in Tanzania. And it's not a hub-and-spoke model. In fact, what you see here, this dark dotted line, is you're seeing mobile refrigerated trucks moving in a very orchestrated way in order to meet the light carrier trucks that then can take those vaccines and essential medical supplies to clinics that are way up there in the corner. That optimized route map actually reduces the amount of gas that's used or fuel that's used. It reduces the amount of time that's required. And it also increases the precision by which pharmaceutical stocks can be maintained in these rural clinics. So you're reducing the number of stockouts as well. A current project that I'm overseeing, and in fact, I just early on had to get on a call with colleagues in the Winnebago Area Health Authority, which is in the remote regions of Northern Ontario. We're working with the Research Ethics Council right now. The project we're working on now is called Operation Remote Immunity. And Operation Remote Immunity is the delivery of vaccines, COVID vaccines, to 31 fly-in remote Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario. Because the roads that lead from Southern Ontario to these communities actually end 200 kilometers short of Moose Factory. So how do you get vaccines then to very rural, very remote Indigenous communities? So part of the research is about logistics optimization. It's about the introduction of new technologies with respect to, for instance, the portable coolers that they're using. It introduces new information management systems around patient management. There's the introduction within Orange, which is the remote ambulatory care service that's delivering this, the introduction of an incident management system and so forth. But at its core, though, at its core in terms of reaching the hardest to reach, it's not just about delivering vaccines, it's how do you engender the trust within communities that have every reason not to trust government and not to trust the medical authorities in taking these vaccines. Moreover, Indigenous remote communities were prioritized in the Ontario legislature. And those communities actually were receiving the vaccines first, which only heightens the importance of trust. So I tell you this story in part to illustrate the innovations, process innovations, business innovations, and policy innovations when it comes to reaching the hardest to reach, but also the very local, very micro-level notions of trust. I recall recently a conversation with Lynn Innes, who is the CEO of the Winnebago Area Health Authority, and I asked her, I said, so when Operation Remote Immunity 1.0 was rolling out, were you nervous? And she said, and I won't use the excluded, but she basically said, hell yeah, I was nervous. This is my community. If we F this up, I lose all trust. I had a conversation with Homer Tien, who is the CEO of Orange. Homer, if you don't know, is not only the CEO of Orange, he was also tasked with being the chief of the Ontario vaccine rollout when Hillier stepped down. Homer Tien is also a trauma surgeon. He's a colonel in the military. He's served numerous tours. And I remember chatting with him, and I said, so what was it like the night before ORI 1.0 was to roll out? And he said, you know, Joe, I've been in wars. I've carried out amputations on the battlefield. I'm a trauma surgeon. I have never been more nervous in my entire life. For the 3 days before ORI's launch, I couldn't sleep. The stakes were so high because if we F this up, we would have betrayed the trust that we had tried to generate with this community or in these communities. What I want to suggest here then is rather than thinking about reaching the hardest to reach as scaling from the metropole to the margins, we actually need to invert our thinking. We need to start at the margins. We need to think about what the conditions are like at the margins, not work with the presumption that what works in Toronto or New York or Chicago is going to work in remote Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario. So over the last 6 or 7 years, I've had the pleasure of working with students and faculty from across a variety of disciplines. You met some of them today. Angela, you met yesterday. Marin led us on the ski shot last night. Karash, of course, you just met now as well. These brilliant students come together. We recruit, we bring them together. They work on these projects for about 12 to 14 months. They work and they represent and they think about the different sectors that are involved. There is no allergy to the private sector, or the public sector, or the third sectors. How do sectors collaborate together to come up with multi-sectoral solutions in terms of what works? You can see here just a smattering of some of the research projects that we've carried out over the last 5 years or so, and we have 10 new case studies coming in this year. And most recently, we've expanded what began at the University of Toronto as the REACH project now to becoming the REACH Alliance, involving 6 new universities, including some in the UK, some in the African continent, some in Latin America, and so forth. And so now we're bringing together not just students and faculty at the U of T, but from around the world. This work is all about impact. The research that the students and faculty are generating together are intended to have an impact. Some of the researchers from these teams have published articles, academic articles, and most recently, we had a piece published in The Lancet. We had a piece published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, the British Medical Journal, the Bulletin of the WHO, and so forth. And these aren't faculty members. These are the student researchers who are publishing in absolutely first-rate journals. The REACH Alliance has now set up a partnership with Global Affairs Canada, where our, again, REACH alum students are presenting their insights to Global Affairs Canada policymakers. Most recently, we just had one last week on localizing solutions in which there were 80 GAC officials on the line listening to what our student researchers had to say. But most importantly, the impact that REACH is having, in my view, it's about cultivating the next generation of leaders. This is a graph that I show to all new REACH researchers. This is based on an article we published in the Bulletin of the WHO, and it uses real data, and I just want to highlight this for you a bit. I'm a political economist, so I get off on this sort of stuff, but it's an important set of insights. What we have here is it's the cost of delivering a sanitation intervention in Latin America. The red line is the average cost. So as you expand coverage outwards, so the bottom axis is population coverage, As you expand coverage outwards, you can see that the average cost of launching that intervention rises slightly. Okay, that makes sense. You see it a little bit higher at the beginning, that's your sunk cost, and then you realize the economies of scale as you go out. What I'm interested in is the marginal cost. The marginal cost is the additional cost to reach that additional person. So when you look at the marginal cost curve here, you can see, for instance, that marginal cost and average cost predictably track pretty well and pretty closely to each other till population coverage hits about 50%. By the time you hit 75%, to get from 75% coverage plus 1, your marginal cost to reach that additional person is 2x over your average cost. By the time you're reaching the very last person, and this isn't hypothetical, this is based on real empirical data, by the time you reach the very last person, the marginal cost to reach that last person is 3.5x over average cost. In other words, and folks in the private sector know full well, once marginal cost and average cost and marginal demand intersect, you're out of the market. Why? Because it doesn't make any sense to continue to press once your marginal cost becomes prohibitively high. So the challenge I put to all these leaders, these researchers, is how do we narrow that gap? That's the challenge before us. How do we get the marginal cost curve to track more closely with the average cost curve? And the answers are quite simple. We need innovation. We need technological innovation. We need business process innovations. We need policy innovations. That should narrow that gap quite considerably, but it will not narrow the gap completely. And what's missing is the will to reach those who are hardest to reach. And that, I would suggest to you, is an ethical question. Are you committed principally and ethically to reach those who are the hardest to reach, even if it doesn't make sense economically and even if it doesn't make sense politically? Are you ethically and principally committed to reaching those who are the hardest to reach? So let me say in closing, the REACH project is one of many initiatives that are going on in my life, but it's the one that I'm most proud of. I think it's had the most impact in terms of the work that we're doing and the knowledge translation that's emanating from it. But most importantly, the impact is being felt in this generation or the next generation of principled global leaders. The REACH Alliance is inspired by the SDGs. The REACH Alliance takes very seriously the notion of leaving no one behind. It's inspired by the SDGs, but I really think it's preparing us for the post-2030 world. Because it's this generation of leaders who are not quite ready to be taking on the reins of leadership, but who will be in the post-2030 world. And it's the agenda that they're going to be establishing, and it's the agenda that they're going to be executing that is going to determine whether we actually ever reach these lofty, principled goals. Trust is at the center of all of this. It requires us to entrust this next generation of leaders to carry this forward. It requires trust between sectors. The suspicions of the private sector, the presumed inefficiencies of the public sector, and the lack of scale of the third sector. It requires trust to overcome all of those biases so that all of those sectors can work together. It's about entrusting this next generation of leaders with the ownership of this agenda, which I think they would very enthusiastically embrace. But it also requires an endowment on the part of the current leaders to provide that generational ownership to the next generation of global leaders. And the last thing I'll simply say is this, and I intimated it yesterday. Reaching the hardest to reach and those who are most marginalized are not just simply an artifact of history. They're not just simply there. They're not just simply the unfortunate consequences of progress. I think, and I certainly have learned from this generation of young leaders, that those who are hardest to reach and those who are at the margins are not just simply a structural consequence of the world around us. They are there because the institutions have been designed to historically and intentionally exclude them. And this is a fundamental difference. This next generation of leaders understands, therefore, that reaching the hardest to reach is not just a technical problem to be solved, but it is, in fact, a principled commitment to redress, and that it's actually a function of justice, which is fundamentally different. So let me just finish by saying I encourage all of you around this room who are thought leaders and leaders of your organizations now to make the space and to prepare ourselves for this next generation of just extraordinarily capable, experienced, audacious, but most importantly, principled leaders. So thank you very much for listening. Appreciate it.